Video for CasAuth v2, I showed how to get the system up and running locally. This time I'm going to show how to do that deployment out into a production AKS cluster in Azure, and I'll probably do another video to show how to do this in app service as well. These videos, though, are not going to focus on how to deploy Kubernetes and how to deploy all the other pieces of Kubernetes or anything. It's just going to focus on the CasAuth pieces. But we have documentation out there for how to do the rest of it. So if we take a look at the pod that I have running out in my Kubernetes cluster, you can see that I've started this up with managed identity. So these are pod identities, and with an ingress controller for an app gateway. And then I put an Ubuntu client out here just so I would have something to test from. But I haven't deployed any of my CAS solution yet. So this is a pretty standard kind of starting point for AKS environment. And it is the preferred option for identity is to use managed identity with CasAuth. So this will work out nicely. We already have that deployed and can get identities that way instead of actually having to store credentials somewhere. Okay, and then I should show, I did create an SSL certificate package out here for my ingress controller as well. And I've already gone out and registered a domain name for all of my services and pointed all that domain name to the ingress controller, since the DNS can take a while to propagate. And I also provisioned all the Azure resources because that can take a while. And in particular, I noticed that when you create the managed identities, it can take like 30 minutes or so before those actually have access to the Azure configuration, app configuration. So those need to be provisioned ahead of time as well. So let's take a look real quick at the Azure resources. So I deployed AKS. Nothing really to see there. That's just standard AKS environment. And then when I put the app gateway up there, it created these other resources for the app gateway. I mentioned that I created some managed identities. So I created a managed identity. This is a user managed identity, or user assigned managed identity is what we call these. I created one for the API pod and one for the auth pod. So we're going to use least privileged access here, so both of those only have the permissions that they need in order to operate. And then I provisioned a configuration vault, app configuration, and I don't have anything deployed out into there right now, so that's great. There's no configuration. We can set that up in a minute. However, because I mentioned that the permissions can take a while, I did in the role assignments, well, let's just do this because there's a lot of role assignments. My identity for authentication, you'll see, has this app configuration data reader, and my API identity also has the app configuration data reader. They do require that specific role to be assigned in order for the managed identity, or any other identity, frankly, to be able to use an Azure AD token to get to the app config. So you do have to configure that. Or I guess you could give it owner or something, but ideally you would give it least privileged access. So that's the least privileged access. And then if we go back and look, we're also going to have a key vault, which is going to store our secrets in it. And so in that same vein, I came over here and gave access, an access policy just to get secrets to the authentication pod identity. Now, we do not need to do that for the API identity because it doesn't need any sort of secrets. Everything it's doing is public. So that's great. We don't need to do anything else there. All right. I also provisioned a Azure Container Registry, gave the AKS environment access to the container registry, so that's ready to go as well. So that's pretty much it for the Azure resources, and the identities really only needed access to app config and the vault. You could also give the managed identity access to the graph API so that you could query for user status for like reissue tokens and stuff like that. I'm not going to do that for this video, but that would be the other permission you'd probably likely give those identities as well, or at least, excuse me, the auth identity. You don't need to do that for the API identity. A couple of things that I did in changing the projects around. These were using the same project files that I used in the first video. However, there were a couple of changes that I needed to make to enable some stuff. So let's look at the API. So in the program CS file, the only thing that I did was I talked about using a log level in the first demo, but I hadn't actually wired up to anything. So now I have wired up logging so that we will actually see the appropriate logs for whatever level we set. That was the only change I made to the program file. In the startup file, I added CORS. So between routing and use authentication, I did have to add in the CORS piece. We didn't need CORS when we were running localhost, but obviously when we go to use this on an actual server, we are going to need CORS in order to work for that. So I did add that. And then finally, I added this health controller. The health controller just responds to /health as an OK status. The reason for that is when we set this up through App Gateway, we're going to need some sort of way to know whether the service is operational or not for the health probes in App Gateway. And so this is how we're going to do that. And then I added the deploy YAML file and the Docker file, again, from the project references that I had. I just copied those directly from the project reference. So that was the only other thing. The sample project reference I'm referring to is the one that we actually have out there for the CasAuth system. Now, if we look at this with auth the auth one as well, same changes. Program, I just added logging. Startup, I added CORS, and then I added the health controller. So exact same thing. And then of course the deploy and Docker file. And then the web project that I didn't even show in the first video, I just copied the web project directly from the sample that I have out in the CasAuth, and it's verbatim, that exact same sample. Really no changes there. Okay, so that's everything that I think we need to get started, so let's step into it. So what we're going to do then is we're going to compile each of these applications. I already have Windows open up here for auth, for API, and web. We're going to build those as Docker images so that we can get those deployed out. We're going to set up the configuration, and then we're going to modify the template files to make sure that we actually have the configuration set the way we want it to. Let's actually start with the configuration. So over in Azure, I'm going to go to my app config. And in my app config instance, I've got a configuration explorer. And we're going to put in all the same settings basically that we put in for running in local. We're going to put into here, and now we're going to set up our clients to pull directly from here. So whatever we want to call this application, I'm just going to call this demo, and then we're going to set this up to use, so when I create this as demo, I can specify the first key I'm going to do is for my authentication service only, and it's for the dev instance of my authentication service. That's what I'm going to push out, and I'm going to specify my client ID. Now, I have this over here at the side, but this is the same client ID that we created in the in the first video. So there, I've got that out here. I can actually show the values there. So there's my client ID. And then I'm going to create another reference for my client secret. Again, this is going to apply only to my dev auth instance. And actually, you know what? I'm not actually even going to put my client secret out here because we're not going to need that for the demo. If we're going to do any sort of auth code flow or anything like that, we would need the client secret. But since we're not going to show that, we won't need that. But we don't need to put in the tenant ID. so that it knows where to get authentication from. So fantastic. And then those are really the kind of two major settings that we need for the auth right now. So let's then do our common settings. So this is settings that are going to apply across a number of implementations, so both API and auth. And we're going to create one for our server host URL. And what this server host URL is going to be is it's going to be the DNS name that I'm going to have my authentication service hosted on. So there we go, auth plosne.com. Again, I've already registered that with DNS and set that up and everything. So we're going to apply that. Just make this a little bigger so we can see everything. Okay, and then we're going to do the same thing, the exact same thing for our client host URL, and this is going to be the URL that we're going to use for our API. And if we had multiple APIs, this would just need to be one of those. The only thing that it really does with these names is it generates a whole bunch of other tokens, or a whole bunch of other settings. So it knows kind of like what to use for base URLs and what to use for issuers and stuff like that. So it just saves a lot of time in actually having to configure all those settings manually. If we just specify the 3 URLs, then it will it'll do a lot of that work for us. So we're going to point this to web plosne.com, and there we go. So now we have an API, an auth, and a web under server, client, and web. And then there are a few other settings that we're going to need. So because we're not going to run in a insecure defaults anymore, we now need to actually create some certificates, and we'll actually need to generate those. So we're going to create a private key, a password for that private key, and a certificate that we can use to sign our JOTs and verify our JOTs. So I am just going to pull up our implementation guide and show where we have those commands. So in the implementation guide down here, it's creating these for the Azure Key Vault. So let's go ahead and do that. Just make a new directory for my keys. Excuse me. Make a new directory for my keys. All right, and then I can run these commands. So I can just take these as is, unless I wanted to change the expiration time or something. These are good the way they are. I do have to create a passphrase for these, and we'll actually have to put that in later. I just used the word secret. Obviously, you'd want to use something a little bit better than that. And we can run the same, and here we have to supply that password. Okay. And then, so if we look at actually what we've got here, we've got the certificate, the PIM files for both the certificate and the private key, and then the PFX. And the PFX is actually what we need to put in the key vault. So we need to base 64 encode that. So here we have the base 64 encoded version. And I'm going to put that into my key vault. Oops. Yeah, as a secret. And we will just call this, this is my private key. I can paste that in there. It's good. And then I can generate a public cert 0. So remember, I can, if you look at the configuration guide, I can have up to 4 public certs for validation. And actually that one, oops, I just need to write out it's already base 64 encoded. Okay. So I grab the whole thing, including the begin and end certificate sections. And that will be my public cert. I actually had used these names earlier in this vault, so I guess I can't reuse that name. It's fine though that it won't actually matter what they're named in the key vault, because the URLs are going to be put into the configuration. So we'll just create it with a new name there. That's fine. And then we will also need to do the password. So we can do private key password. And I think it's probably going to balk at that as well. Oops. Because I've used that name before. Yep. So we'll just call this PW. All right. So good enough. So those are the three things, the three secrets that I need in order for the solution to work. And so I'm going to step back to my config instance. And in here, if I go to the Configuration Explorer, I can now add key vault references. And so that's what I'm going to do. So again, this is going to be demo, and this is these keys and stuff will need to happen on the authentication node. So just demo auth dev, and then we'll say private key, which that is the that word does have to be the literal private key, because that's the name of the variable that we're going to store the URL in. But here we can pick our key vault. And we can look at the secrets, and private key is this one, and we can apply that. And then we can choose another reference. This one's going to be demo auth dev, and this is going to be public cert 0. And so we'll pick our public cert. And then we will create another key vault reference, and this one's going to be demo auth dev private key password. Oops. And again, we'll choose our vault. Select the vault, select the secret, password, and latest version. Okay. So now we have our complete configuration for our solution in here, and that really should be good for that. So then we can go to actually compiling and putting our actual containers out there and pointing them to that configuration. Let's take a look, I guess, first at the authentication service and look at the deploy YAML file and see what we need to update in here. So the first thing we probably need to do is put in our identities. So for the authentication for the authentication service identity, if I come out here and I look at my identity, the client ID is specified right there. So I can put in the client ID, and then if I go to properties, we can look at the resource ID. And I can put that in as well. So that's great. And then I think all the rest of this is okay. Let's go ahead and make this 2.0 for our image, just in case anything has changed since when I was prepping this demo. And the configuration keys are actually called demo, so we'll rename these demo. So we're going to go into debug mode, we're going to host on port 80, we're going to hit our app config instance, and we're going to use all the keys that are coded for demo auth dev, and all the keys that are coded demo common dev. And I think everything else in here is pretty much fine. Yep. My host name is correct, and the SSL cert and stuff, you would change those if, for your environment. Okay, so we're good there on the auth. Let's take a look at the API. And again, I think the first thing let's do is fix these identities. So if I come out here and I look at the API identity, I've got my client ID here. And if I go to properties, I've got my resource ID here. All right, so that's good. Let me come down here. Let's also change this to 2.0. We're going to go and debug. We're going to host on port 80. We're going to use the app config, same instance that we had before. Of course, the keys need to also be demo API, dev, and demo common dev. And then we're going to present a configuration for our web on demo web dev. And that actually reminds me that we did not actually add any configuration settings for our web, and we do need to do that. So we can come back over here. And in the Configuration Explorer, there's two settings we need here. This is related to the specific sample that I have. But demo web dev, there needs to be a login URL, which is the URL to hit when you click the login button. That's going to be auth.plosne.com/cas/authorize. And the second URL I am going to need is the me URL. That's the URL that's going to, when you actually hit to say, who am I? This is going to be the URL that it hits to show you that. So we're going to configure that for the API, and then cas me. Okay. So auth.plosne.com/cas/authorize, and then API plosne.com cas me. Okay, looks good. So that's everything for our web. And then if I look at our web deploy file, pretty much good with everything in here, except we want to change this to version 2. We can see the URL that we're going to pull for configuration. That's going to give us that present config. We're going to host on port 80. All that is good. Our SSL cert, everything really is great there. So there we have that one. Okay, so now let's come over here and let's build the containers, and we can push those up to the container registry. So I can do a Docker build. Should go, actually, I've got it in these files right here. Except this is my authentication service. So I'm going to build this as authentication 2.0. Okay, good. And then I'm going to do a Docker push and push this up into my container registry. Oops. Okay, it's good. It's really the same image apparently as what I had before. That's fine. I'm going to do a Docker build. This time we're going to build the API as version 2. Oops. Oh, I didn't actually put the word build in here. Build. All right, there we go. We're going to do a Docker push on that same API. Okay, it's all good. And we're going to do a Docker build -t, and this one's going to be our web service. Okay. And we will try and push that one as well. Okay, that one's a little bit different, so that's fine. Okay, great. So now everything's pushed out there. So in our registry, we now have the 2.0 versions of all of our services. So now we can actually do a kubectl apply and deploy all the components of our application. Okay. All right. And let's actually look and see how we're doing. Okay. So looks like all of our services are still kind of starting up. It is going to take a minute for those services to actually go out and hit the app config and get the settings for that, and then also it has to provision the load balancer, the ingress controller, and all the rules on those. And then it's got to go through 3 health checks before these actually come up okay. So it looks like Web's kind of finished that, so these other 2 that are actually pulling from the app config are probably taking a minute. But we can see what happens with those. Go ahead and look at the logs. Okay, good. So it's almost up. Okay, great. So, great. So those all services all came up. We should check something then, which is out in Azure. We should check our AKS environment and look at our app gateway. And there's this handy backend health feature on here, which will tell us whether it actually sees traffic flowing down to those health endpoints we put up in this service. And we do. So you can see here we have our web, our API, and our auth, and so it says we're getting traffic down to all those, and that's great. And the services are operational in here, so that's pretty good. So now let's actually just try to curl this. Let's just hit our authorize endpoint. Not for our API though. That doesn't make any sense. I want to do this for our auth. Okay, great. And so that gave us a redirection URL, so at least we know that's up. And then for our API service, we can try and hit the me endpoint, and we won't be authorized, but that's okay. I just want to make sure the endpoint was at least up. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now what we should be able to do is just go to our web, plosne.com, and we should, if everything's working correctly, just load in and work here. Yep, okay, great. So that pulled our configuration. We've got a login prompt as well as some information to get our user info. So let's try the login. And you'll notice it redirected me to the Microsoft Azure Active Directory endpoint. It would send me through login. This is actually a window where I was logged into the Azure portal, so it just took my credentials. If I wasn't logged in, then of course it would take me through the login prompts. And now if I get user info, I can now get info about myself. So there's my email address, my name, and my OID in this tenant. So that all worked perfectly, and we now have a fully deployed and working service out in Kubernetes. And that's really the entire scope of this video, was to get all these services up and running. So thanks.